Picture this. 30,000 years before Christ, when massive glaciers stretched across continents like frozen oceans, and the night held terrors we can barely imagine today. In this world of perpetual cold and darkness, fire wasn't just useful, it was the difference between life and death. And here's the thing that should make your blood boil. Fire belonged to only a select few, the firekeepers. That's what they called themselves. These weren't just your average cave dwellers with a knack for starting fires. No, these were the ultimate gatekeepers of survival itself. Imagine if today only a handful of people controlled all the electricity, all the heating, all the cooking fuel. That's essentially what we're talking about here, except the stakes were infinitely higher. These firekeepers maintained their power through what we'd recognize today as a classic protection racket. They kept eternal flames burning in sacred caves, jealously guarded like the nuclear codes of the Stone Age. Think about the logistics for a moment, keeping fires burning continuously for years, decades, maybe even centuries. The amount of fuel, the constant vigilance, the backup systems. It was an industrial operation disguised as religious ceremony. Common people, hunters, gatherers, families trying to survive another brutal winter had to come begging, literally begging. They'd bring offerings, the choicest cuts of meat, rare stones, precious furs. All for what? A burning branch, a few glowing coals wrapped in moss. And here's the truly diabolical part. They made it seem sacred. The firekeepers wrapped their monopoly in ritual and mysticism, convincing people that fire could only be properly created through elaborate ceremonies blessed by the shamans. The process was deliberately complex and unreliable. First, you needed firestones, not just any rocks, but specific types that could produce sparks when struck together. These weren't lying around everywhere. Then came the sacred tinder, prepared according to ancient recipes and blessed by the holy men. The ritual itself could take hours. And that's if everything went perfectly, which it often didn't. Try starting a fire with stones and dried moss when it's raining, or when the wind is howling through your shelter. More often than not, you'd end up cold, hungry, and even more dependent on the firekeepers. But here's where our story gets interesting, because even in this rigid system, human ingenuity was waiting to break free. Enter Grok, and, yes, I know how that name sounds to modern ears, but bear with me. Grok was a young hunter from what the ancient oral traditions call the Frost clan. He wasn't anybody special in the social hierarchy, not a shaman, not a chief's son, just a guy trying to make it through another day in the Ice Age. The moment that changed everything happened after what we'd call a really bad day at the office. Grok had been out hunting, and it had gone terribly. No game, no food, just the long trudge back to camp carrying nothing but disappointment and an armload of firewood. But as he walked, something caught his attention. The dry branches he was carrying were getting warm where they rubbed against each other. Not just a little warm, actually hot. Now, most people would have filed this away as a minor curiosity and forgotten about it. But Grok had the kind of mind that notices patterns, that asks, what if? What if this wasn't just coincidence? What if this heat could become something more? That night, while his clan slept around their precious borrowed fire, Grok snuck away to a hidden cave, and there, in secret, he began to experiment. He tried different combinations of wood. He varied the pressure, the speed, the angle. Night after night, failure after failure, he worked by the light of stolen embers, trying to unlock what seemed impossible. And then it happened. A wisp of smoke, a tiny glowing ember. Fire. Fire created not by sacred stones or blessed tinder or elaborate rituals, but by the simple friction of wood against wood, soft wood against hard wood, spun between his palms until the friction generated enough heat to ignite dry moss. What the firekeepers claimed took hours of preparation and ritual, Grok could now do in minutes with materials any hunter could find. But here's what makes this story truly revolutionary. Grok didn't keep his discovery to himself. In a world where knowledge was power and power was hoarded, he made a choice that would echo through human history. He began to teach others. Picture the scene. desperate families, shivering in the endless cold, learning that they could create their own fire, that they didn't need to beg, didn't need to offer precious goods to the firekeepers, didn't need to depend on anyone else for this most basic necessity of survival. The friction method wasn't just a new technique, it was liberation itself. Word of Grok's revolutionary discovery couldn't stay hidden forever, and when it reached the ears of Tharg the Eternal, supreme firekeeper of the northern tribes, the response was swift and brutal. Tharg understood immediately what was at stake. This wasn't just about fire-making techniques. This was about the complete collapse of the social order that had existed for 10,000 years. The confrontation came at the Great Council Circle, where representatives from dozens of clans gathered under the northern lights. Tharg, draped in the sacred furs of his office, denounced Grok as a heretic and a fool. The old ways were sacred, blessed by the ancestors, proven over countless generations. Who was this young upstart to challenge the wisdom of ages? But Grok had brought something more powerful than words: demonstration. Right there, in front of the assembled elders, he took 2 pieces of common wood, the kind anyone could find, and within minutes had created fire. No stones, no blessed tinder, no elaborate rituals, just friction, pressure, and technique. The silence that followed must have been deafening, because in that moment, everyone present understood that the world had just changed forever. Tharg's response was predictable but futile. He declared Grok an enemy of the people, a destroyer of sacred traditions. He sentenced him to exile in the frozen wasteland, expecting that the harsh winter would claim this troublemaker within days. But here's the beautiful irony. Exile wasn't Grok's death sentence, it was his opportunity, because now he was free to carry his revolutionary knowledge beyond the reach of the firekeepers, to the outcasts and wanderers who lived on the margins of tribal society. And these people, who had nothing to lose and everything to gain, would become the first converts to a new way of living. As Grok disappeared into the swirling snow, carrying nothing but his knowledge and his determination, the firekeepers thought they had won. They had no idea they had just lit the fuse on their own destruction. What happened next would make the collapse of every monopoly in human history look like a minor business adjustment. Within a single winter, think about that time frame for a moment. The monopoly that had lasted for millennia began to crumble like a house of cards in a hurricane. This is what happens when you try to contain revolutionary technology. It's like trying to hold back a river with your bare hands. Grok hadn't disappeared into the wasteland to die quietly, as Tharg the Eternal had expected. No, he'd done something far more dangerous to the established order. He'd found others, like himself, outcasts, rebels, people who had been pushed to the margins of tribal society. And to these forgotten souls, Grok offered something more precious than gold or food. He offered independence. His disciples called themselves the Free Flames. Picture that name echoing across the frozen tundra, whispered around dying fires and shared in secret gatherings. The Free Flames weren't just learning a new technique, they were joining a revolution that would reshape human civilization. The beauty of Grok's discovery lay in its elegant simplicity. You take a straight stick, any straight stick will do, and you spin it between your palms against a notched board of harder wood. The friction generates heat, the heat creates an ember, and dry moss catches that ember into flame. What once required rare firestones and blessed tinder now used materials you could find anywhere. What once took hours of ceremony and prayer now took minutes of focused effort. But here's what made this spread so unstoppable. It was democratic. You didn't need special bloodlines or years of training or approval from religious authorities. Any person with 2 hands and the willingness to learn could master this technique, and once you learned it, you owned it. No one could take it away from you. The Free Flames spread across the tundra like wildfire itself, teaching the friction method to anyone desperate enough to listen. And in that harsh world, desperation was never in short supply. They found audiences among the exile camps, the failed hunters, the families who had fallen out of favor with the firekeepers. These people had nothing to lose and everything to gain. The firekeepers, naturally, didn't take this challenge lying down. Tharg the Eternal wasn't called eternal for nothing. He'd survived decades of tribal politics and wasn't about to let some upstart with a wooden stick destroy his power base. He forged what the ancient songs call the Alliance of Sacred Flames, uniting traditional clans in what we'd recognize today as economic warfare. Think about the weapons at Tharg's disposal. He controlled the trade routes. No clan using the friction method could trade for obsidian, shells, or other precious goods. He manipulated marriage alliances. Any family accepting the new way found their children unmarriageable to traditional clans. He denied hunting rights in the richest territories, forcing friction fire users to scrape by in marginal lands. But here's the thing about trying to suppress revolutionary technology through economic pressure. It only works if people have something to lose, and most of the people learning Grok's method were already living on the edge of survival. You can't boycott someone who's already been excluded from your system. For every family the firekeepers punished, 3 more learned the friction secret in hidden valleys and remote camps. The knowledge spread like a contagion, carried by traders, wanderers, and refugees. Soon, even some members of traditional clans were secretly learning the technique, just in case. The transformation of daily life was immediate and profound. Think about what this meant for ordinary people. Women who had spent half their waking hours tending borrowed flames, keeping them alive, protecting them from wind and rain, rationing fuel to make embers last until the next trip to the firekeepers, suddenly found themselves free. Free to focus on food preparation, childcare, crafts, or simply rest. Hunting parties could range farther than ever before. Previously, they'd been limited by how far they could travel and still return before their borrowed fire died out. Now they could venture into distant territories, knowing they could create warmth and cooking fire anywhere they found wood and dry tinder. But perhaps the most revolutionary change was cultural. Evening activities exploded as families gathered around their own fires instead of huddling together around a single precious flame. Personal storytelling traditions were born. Children learned not just the ancient tribal myths, but family stories, individual experiences, personal dreams and fears. The firelight became intimate instead of communal, and with that intimacy came new forms of human expression. The turning point came at what the oral histories call the Battle of Burning Ridge. Picture this scene. A traditional firekeeper army, 500 strong, advancing on a settlement of friction fire users who numbered barely 200. The firekeepers expected easy victory after all. They had superior numbers, better weapons, and the blessing of the ancestors. But the friction fire users had something the traditional forces couldn't match: tactical flexibility. When the battle began at dawn, the defenders quickly created multiple defensive fires along the ridgeline, not just 1 or 2 precious flames that had to be protected at all costs, but dozens of fires that could be lit, abandoned, and rekindled as needed. The traditional forces, burdened by their cumbersome fire-starting rituals, found themselves unable to adapt. When their borrowed embers were scattered by wind and combat, they couldn't quickly relight them. Meanwhile, their enemies created new fires wherever they needed them, using the defensive flames to heat weapons, create smoke screens, and signal between scattered groups. The psychological impact was devastating. The firekeepers had built their entire identity around being the masters of flame, but here they were, outmaneuvered by common people who could create fire faster and more reliably than the priests themselves. When Tharg's nephew was captured, trying to start a signal fire with the old stone method, while friction fire users lit 3 fires around him in the time it took him to gather his sacred tinder, the myth of firekeeper superiority died forever. The victory at Burning Ridge broke more than military might. It shattered psychological dominance. Word spread across the northern territories that the firekeepers could be beaten, that their ancient power was not divine but simply technological. And now that technology had been democratized, in the months following the battle, the trickle of conversions became a flood. Entire clans abandoned the old ways overnight. Fire temples were abandoned or converted to common gathering places. The sacred firestones, once worth a hunter's life, became curiosities that children played with. Fire belonged to humanity now, not to the chosen few, not to the priests and shamans, but to anyone willing to learn a simple technique. The age of artificial scarcity was ending, and the age of technological democracy had begun. But this was just the beginning. What happened next would accelerate human progress in ways that still echo through our modern world. The decade following the Battle of Burning Ridge witnessed something unprecedented in human prehistory, the greatest technological leap our species had ever experienced. And here's what's truly remarkable about it. This explosion of innovation didn't happen in universities or research labs, but around countless individual fires lit by ordinary people who suddenly had the freedom to experiment. Think about the compound effects we're talking about here. When you democratize a fundamental technology like fire, you don't just change how people stay warm or cook food. You unleash human creativity on a scale that reshapes civilization itself. Enter Mira the Farwalker, whose story perfectly captures this new age of exploration. Mira was a trader, one of those hardy souls who carried goods between distant tribes across mountain passes and frozen rivers. Before Grok's revolution, her routes were limited by the reach of firekeeper territories. She could only venture as far as the next sacred flame, carrying borrowed embers that might die in a sudden storm or strong wind. But armed with a friction fire kit, a simple collection of wooden sticks and dry tinder that weighed almost nothing, Mira redrew the map of the known world. She crossed mountain passes previously thought impossible, carried trade goods to isolated valleys that hadn't seen outsiders in generations, and opened commercial routes that connected tribes separated by hundreds of miles of wilderness. The ripple effects were staggering. The singing, river people, isolated in their remote canyon for countless generations, suddenly gained access to obsidian from the glass mountain tribes. In return, they shared their sophisticated pottery techniques, made possible by their experimentation with different firing temperatures now that they could create and control flames at will. The Cave Bear clan, always known for their mechanical ingenuity, developed what they called the fire bow. Instead of spinning the friction stick between their palms, which was tiring and sometimes ineffective, in cold weather when hands were stiff, they created a bow mechanism that spun the stick with mechanical advantage. This wasn't just an improvement, it was innovation building on innovation, the kind of technological advancement that only happens when knowledge flows freely. But here's where the story gets really interesting. Different groups, working independently with the same basic principle, began developing variations tailored to their specific environments and needs. The ice walkers of the far north created friction methods using bone instead of wood, because in their treeless landscape, caribou antlers were more available than timber. The marsh dwellers developed techniques using bundled reeds that worked even in high humidity. Each variation was an experiment, and each experiment taught lessons that spread to other groups. This is how technological progress accelerates, not through central planning or hierarchical research, but through distributed innovation by people solving their own immediate problems. The population explosion that followed was unlike anything in human history up to that point. And I want you to understand the mechanics of this, because they'll repeat throughout human development. When you can create fire reliably, infant mortality plummets. Newborns can be kept warm through cold nights. Food can be cooked thoroughly, reducing disease. Medicine can be prepared with heated water and sterilized tools. But it goes deeper than immediate survival. Food preservation improved dramatically when families could maintain cooking fires for extended periods without rationing fuel. Meat could be smoked properly, vegetables could be dried systematically, and surplus food could be stored for lean seasons. This food security allowed tribes to grow beyond the razor's edge of subsistence living. The numbers are staggering when you consider the scale. Tribal populations that had remained stable for generations suddenly doubled within a few decades. The carrying capacity of the land increased not because the environment changed, but because human technology had advanced to better exploit existing resources. New settlements appeared in previously uninhabitable regions. The high mountain valleys, the deep forest interiors, the edges of the great ice sheets, places where the difficulty of maintaining borrowed fire had made permanent settlement impossible, suddenly became viable. If you could create fire anywhere, you could live anywhere that provided food and water. And with this expansion came cultural fusion on an unprecedented scale. When the friction-using wind tribes met the traditional firekeeper stone people at what the legends call the Great Gathering of 15,000 before Christ, something remarkable happened. Instead of the expected conflict between new and old ways, there was synthesis. Picture this massive gathering, 15,000 people from dozens of different tribes, some using friction fire, others clinging to the old methods, many somewhere in between. The potential for violence was enormous. These weren't just different techniques, they represented completely different worldviews about power, knowledge, and social organization. But instead of warfare, there were marriage alliances. Young people from friction fire tribes fell in love with partners from traditional clans, and these unions created something new, hybrid techniques that combined the best of both approaches. Children learned both ways, growing up bilingual in the language of fire creation. The social implications were revolutionary. The rigid hierarchies based on fire access crumbled like ancient ice in spring sunshine. When anyone could create fire, leadership had to be based on other qualities: hunting skill, wisdom, charisma, strategic thinking. Merit began to matter more than birthright. Art flourished in this new world of readily available light. Cave walls that had remained blank for millennia suddenly bloomed with paintings created by firelight that could be sustained for hours without worry about waste. The famous flame gallery cave system, in what we now call France, contains layer upon layer of artwork from this period, each layer representing a generation that had more time and light to devote to creative expression. Language itself evolved to accommodate the new reality. Ancient word lists preserved in tribal memory show dozens of new terms entering common use. Different words for the various stages of friction, fire creation, the subtle sounds that indicated success or failure, the different types of smoke that meant your tinder was ready or your wood was too green. Even more fascinating are the borrowed words terms from distant tribes that entered local languages through the expanded trade networks that fire democratization made possible. You can trace the spread of innovation by following these linguistic exchanges, watching how a word for a new firebow technique spreads from the Cave Bear clan through a dozen other tribes within a generation. The metallurgy experiments that began during this period deserve special mention, because they represent humanity's first steps toward the Bronze Age and everything that followed. When you can create and maintain hot fires at will, you inevitably begin experimenting with heating rocks, clay, and eventually metals. The first copper working didn't happen in some advanced civilization, it happened around the personal fires of curious individuals who noticed how certain green stones changed when heated. These weren't trained metallurgists. They were ordinary people with time to experiment because they no longer spent their days worrying about keeping borrowed flames alive. But perhaps the most profound change was psychological. For the first time in human history, individuals had true energy independence. They weren't dependent on priests, leaders, or specialists for this most basic necessity of survival. This psychological shift toward self-reliance and individual capability would echo through every subsequent human advancement. The confidence to explore, to experiment, to take risks, all of this stemmed from the simple knowledge that you could create fire anywhere you went. Risk tolerance increased dramatically when people knew they could survive in unfamiliar territory. This psychological change was as important as the technological one, maybe more so. As this transformational decade drew to a close, humanity had fundamentally changed, not just in what we could do, but in how we thought about what was possible. The age of artificial scarcity imposed by gatekeepers was ending, and the age of individual empowerment had begun. But the real test was yet to come. Would these changes last? Could this new way of life survive the challenges that lay ahead? The answer would reshape not just human society, but human nature itself. 20,000 years after Grok's death, his simple innovation had accomplished something that still boggles the mind. It had reshaped humanity itself. Not just human society or human technology, but the actual physical and mental evolution of our species. And the compound advantages were so staggering that they continue to echo through our lives today, sitting in our climate-controlled homes, cooking on our gas stoves, gathering around our electronic hearths. Let's start with the physical changes, because they're the most dramatic and the easiest to measure. Consistent cooking, made possible by reliable fire, had literally changed human anatomy. When you can cook food thoroughly and regularly, you need less digestive apparatus to process it. Our guts got smaller, our teeth changed, our jaws became less massive. But here's the really fascinating part. All that biological energy that used to go toward digestion got redirected toward brain development. Think about the implications. The human brain is an incredibly expensive organ from an energy perspective. It consumes about 20% of our total caloric intake, despite being only 2% of our body weight. Before reliable cooking, that level of brain development was simply impossible for most individuals. There wasn't enough surplus energy to support both robust digestion and complex thinking. But when fire democratization made consistent cooking available to everyone, not just the elite with access to firekeeper flames, it triggered a species-wide leap in cognitive development. Archaeological evidence from this period shows rapid increases in skull capacity, more sophisticated tool creation, and increasingly complex artistic expression. We're talking about observable evolutionary change happening in mere millennia rather than the hundreds of thousands of years typically required. The cultural acceleration was even more dramatic. Those extended evening activities around personal fires had unleashed something unprecedented. Mass education. When families could afford to burn light for hours instead of hoarding every ember, children began learning not just survival skills, but stories, songs, complex ideas about the world beyond their immediate experience. Oral tradition exploded during this period. The epic poems, creation myths, and heroic sagas that would later be written down by literate civilizations. Most of these were born around friction fires in the centuries following Grok's revolution. The Iliad, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Norse Eddas, the creation stories of indigenous peoples worldwide, they all trace back to this period when light became cheap and knowledge could spread freely. But perhaps most importantly, fire democratization had given humanity the confidence to explore. And explore we did. The fossil record shows human expansion accelerating dramatically during this period. We spread to Australia, to the Americas, to the remote islands of the Pacific. Why? Because Grok's simple technique had eliminated the single greatest barrier to human migration, the fear of being unable to create warmth and cooking fire in unknown territories. When you know you can create fire anywhere, you can live anywhere that provides food and water. The psychological transformation was as important as the technological one. Humans went from being cautious, territory-bound creatures to bold explorers willing to cross oceans and continents in search of new opportunities. By 15,000 before Christ, human settlements existed on every continent except Antarctica. That's a stunning achievement when you consider that just 15,000 years earlier, most humans lived within walking distance of a firekeeper temple. The democratization of fire had literally spread humanity across the globe. The mythological impact proved equally enduring, and this is where our story connects most directly to the modern world. Every culture that emerged from this period developed its own version of the Grok story. The details changed, the names were different, but the core narrative remained the same. A rebel who defied the established order to bring forbidden knowledge to humanity. The Norse told of Loki stealing fire from the gods. The Greeks spoke of Prometheus chained to a rock for bringing flame to mortals. Native American traditions include countless trickster figures who outwit the spirits to obtain fire for their people. Polynesian myths tell of Maui fishing fire from the underworld. Hindu tradition speaks of Matarisvan carrying fire to earth. But here's what's remarkable. These aren't just different versions of the same story. They're cultural memories of the same historical period, preserved and retold for 20,000 years. Every culture remembers the moment when fire stopped belonging to the few and became the birthright of all humanity. These myths did more than preserve history. They created a template for innovation that would inspire future revolutionaries. The pattern was established. Transformative knowledge cannot be contained, artificial scarcity cannot be maintained indefinitely, and individual innovation can overthrow entire systems of control. From Johannes Gutenberg's printing press to Tim Berners-Lee's World Wide Web, The pattern Grok established has repeated throughout human history. Monopolies rise, innovations challenge them, knowledge spreads despite attempts at suppression, and humanity advances. The internet itself is just the latest iteration of Grok's friction fire, a simple technique that democratizes access to something previously controlled by gatekeepers. The strategic legacy runs even deeper. Every successful technology revolution since has followed the same playbook. Start with the outcasts and margins, prove the concept works, let economic pressure drive adoption, watch established powers try and fail to suppress the change, then celebrate as the innovation becomes universal. Silicon Valley entrepreneurs studying market disruption are unknowingly following a playbook written 30,000 years ago by an exiled hunter with 2 sticks and some dry moss. The venture capitalists funding startups that challenge established industries are betting on the same principle Grok proved, that transformative technology spreads faster than institutional resistance can adapt. But there's something even more profound at work here. Grok's revolution established human beings as the technological species. Before fire democratization, we were just another group of primates using basic tools. After it, we became the creatures who reshape our environment through innovation rather than adapting to it through evolution. Every technology that followed agriculture, metallurgy, writing, machinery, electronics, artificial intelligence builds on the foundation Grok laid. Not the specific technique of friction fire, but the deeper principle it represents. That knowledge belongs to humanity, not to those who claim special authority over it. When we look around our modern world, we're surrounded by the descendants of Grok's simple innovation. The gas flame under your cooking pot, the pilot light in your furnace, the spark that starts your car engine, all of these trace their lineage back to that first friction fire in a hidden cave. But more than that, every time we learn something new on the internet, every time we share knowledge freely instead of hoarding it, every time we choose innovation over tradition simply because it works better, we're living out the values Grok established when he chose to teach his technique instead of keeping it secret. The eternal ember he lit wasn't just a physical flame. It was the idea that human knowledge should serve all humanity, not just the powerful few. That simple principle, sparked into existence 30,000 years ago, continues to burn in every laboratory, every classroom, every garage workshop where someone is trying to solve problems and share solutions. As we face the challenges of our modern world, climate change, resource scarcity, technological disruption, we're still drawing on the wisdom of that first prehistoric rebel. The solution isn't to hoard knowledge or restrict innovation to protect existing interests. The solution is to democratize it, share it, let it spread as widely and quickly as possible. We are Grok's children, inheritors of his revolutionary spirit and keepers of his eternal flame. Every match we strike, every idea we share, every problem we solve connects us to that moment 30,000 years ago, when one person's impossible trick didn't just cut fire starting time in half, it cut humanity's chains and lit the path to everything we've become. The fire burns on. And as long as human beings value knowledge over ignorance, innovation over stagnation, and sharing over hoarding, it always will. The ember Grok kindled in that frozen cave has become the flame of human civilization itself, and that flame will never be extinguished.